Had he lived, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would be celebrating his 57th birthday today. Instead, the nation prepares to celebrate a holiday in his honor. Tonight, we'll see how Detroit played a major role in his path to greatness. Channel 7's Erik Smith traces the steps in a close-up report. King remembered.
It took Martin Luther King Jr. 39 years to reach his mountaintop. The steps painstakingly measured, each stride timed in the careful cadence of nonviolent confrontation. The long journey to his vision of a new America began with a simple act of resistance by a gentle lady named Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama. The rest, as they say, is history. Rosa Parks was one of many links in the chain that bound Martin Luther King to the city of Detroit. As a young preacher, he had already brought his philosophy to the pulpit of Detroit Central Methodist Church in 1955, months before the Montgomery bus boycott catapulted his name into the national consciousness. His friends have often said that in a real sense, Detroit was really his northern home.
Yeah, I can remember him walking down John R. and going into the Gotham Hotel, and the guys there just chatting with him like he was one of the good old boys. And he, at that time, was not only a national figure, but was fast becoming an international figure.
That our struggle in the United States, in a sense, is a part of a worldwide struggle for freedom and human dignity.
His most dramatic Michigan moment was still to come when Martin King was given the NAACP's most prestigious award in Detroit in 1957. Then in 1959, as his crusade for human dignity was stirring the country's sleeping conscience, he forged an important coalition with UAW President Walter Reuther, a black and white bond that linked the North to the South, the Motor City to Montgomery, and sadly, Memphis. August 28, 1963, a golden day in civil rights history, the Dream March on Washington, D.C., and from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. steps across time and into eternity. But 45 days earlier on the streets of Detroit, the real history was made as thousands joined the March for Freedom down Woodward Avenue.
The Detroit March, I think, will go down in history as the most significant public expression, organized expression of conscience of black and white Americans.
Some say 200,000 marched down Woodward Avenue that day. As many as could fill the hall then listened to Martin Luther King speak from the podium of Cobo Arena. Listened as he first uttered the now immortal words, "I have a dream."
I have a dream this afternoon that one day right here in Detroit, when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing with the Negroes in the spiritual of all, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty.
History will record Martin Luther King's March on Washington and the great speech made at the Lincoln Memorial at that time as unquestionably a turning point. But I think that we in Detroit know that the basis for the proving ground, perhaps even the generator of that historic event, took place on Woodward Avenue in Detroit in 1963.
In a real sense, we are through with segregation now, henceforth, and forevermore.
The words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as we remember him in Detroit. I'm Erik Smith, Channel 7 Action News, reporting.
Tomorrow, we'll see how Detroiters started a 15-year crusade to make King's birthday a national holiday.
It took 15 years of dedicated work to make Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday. Tonight, Channel 7's Erik Smith continues his close-up report, King Remembered, with a look at 3 Detroiters who not only started but sustained that crusade.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday.
I just want to do God's
God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
His voice was stilled almost 18 years ago on one of the century's darkest days, plunging every American of goodwill into a time of grief and for many despair. Dr. Martin Luther King was gone, but that his philosophy of nonviolent social change might live, a campaign was undertaken to commemorate his birthday as a national holiday. A few voices in the wilderness were first raised. One of them belonged to Detroit Congressman John Conyers.
We said from the beginning that in Black America, we're going to observe King's birthday no matter what. People began putting it into the calendars even though it was unofficial. And then, of course, the states and the cities began their observances. Again, Michigan was one of the first states to pass a state law honoring Dr. King's birthday.
In the halls of the state capitol building in Lansing, the Michigan Martin Luther King Day campaign was sparked by a young senator named Jackie Vaughn, who found the grounds of Michigan more fertile to the seed of an idea that would take years and years and years to grow in Washington.
We gave incentive because when we passed ours, we could say to the Michigan delegation, look, this is what we have accomplished, and therefore we want you to do what we've done.
Year after year after year, the Dr. Martin Luther King holiday bill was introduced into the Congress, and year after year after year, it waited in the wings until the final effort was mounted.
The bill was passed through the incredible effort of Detroit and Metro Detroit and Michigan residents who sustained us during many of those lean 16 years with the petitions and letters to their congressmen and senators. And then, of course, Stevie Wonder, the little genius that he is, happened to just write a song. Happy birthday, Dr. Martin Luther King.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you.
Even though it did take a long time, it is a reality now. It is going to be celebrated forever. We have, in this time, in this space of time that we are alive, done something that has only happened one time before for President George Washington.
Happy birthday.
Tomorrow, we'll see just how close Dr. King came to making Detroit his home.
Years before Dr. Martin Luther King became a national figure, he made annual visits to our area. Continuing his close-up report, King Remembered, Erik Smith shows us just how close Dr. King came to making Detroit his home.
The 1960s, the stormy days of social protest. Detroit's Central Methodist Church was a beacon of liberal light, a symbol of the conscience of the North. It was not surprising then that Martin Luther King Jr. often came to this church in Detroit to preach the gospel of brotherhood. What may surprise many, however, is the fact that he was once asked to make that church his permanent home.
Offered him the job.
Offered him the job. And Dr. King said that his mission was, he was very appreciative, but his mission was much larger than for one state. And that made sense. Yeah. We all had the benefit of his teaching.
Martin Luther King took his crusade far beyond Detroit during those years, of course, but despite his demanding travel and speaking schedule, he still found time to return each year to the pulpit of Central Methodist Church, and each time he came, he was escorted around Detroit by a young minister named Ed Willingham.
And I remember in those early years that just being in the car, a young minister not too far out of seminary, talking with him about what did that mean? What was all this happening? And why did he get into it? And he would share those thoughts with me. Later, in the next 2 or 3 years, there'd be a bodyguard in the car with me. But even in the cars, we'd ride back and forth, and I'd say, now, how do you handle that business of being in jail? Don't you feel angry with people? He said, no, that's not going to help this if we're going to get anywhere on that. That made a deep impression on me as one who was then probably 30 years old.
Dr. Claude Young served as Martin Luther King's personal physician whenever his travels brought him to Detroit. From the earliest days of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. Young was there with the soon-to-be martyred civil rights leader.
When he got stabbed in New York, it was then that I began to get a lot more sensitive. My dates, chronologically, I may not be important. But I then began to realize that we were going to have a real national leadership, and a movement was coming.
Well, I remember Martin, as a classmate at Morehouse College, as being a very conscientious student. But he was not an active campus leader. And so I remember that, you know, in relation to what he ultimately did.
Arthur Johnson was a classmate in the mid-1940s when Martin Luther King Jr. was attending Morehouse College. One of Detroit's early civil rights activists, Arthur Johnson shared the vision and the dream of the man who has been called a modern-day Moses.
As I think back about him and this short life, of course there's one of sadness, that it could not have been a longer life. But then he understood it's not how long one lives, but how well one lives. And I'm grateful to him, often moved emotionally.
With this faith, we will be able to achieve this new day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing with the Negroes in the spiritual of all, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty.
The words of Dr. Martin Luther King, no stranger to the city of Detroit, for it was here that many of his crusades were actually begun. From Central Methodist Church downtown, I'm Erik Smith, Channel 7 Action News, reporting.
That an assassin quieted the voice of a great dreamer, but Dr. Martin Luther King's vision was real enough to be the basis for a national holiday in his honor. We mark the celebration with the conclusion of Erik Smith's close-up report, King Remembered.
So let us all begin. We know it's up and win. Let it out, don't hold it in. Say it loud as you can. Happy birthday to you.
And I immediately started running upstairs to where he was, and I caught his head, and I tried to feel his head, and I asked him, I said, Dr. King, do you hear me? Dr. King, do you hear me?
He was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. as a result of a gunshot wound in the right side of the neck.
Happy birthday to you. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
He excited us like we've never been excited before. Obviously, as a black person, we love that, but he was for all of humanity. I think it's up to us to implement his teaching, his idealism, and I think more importantly, bringing people together in this kind of chaotic world.
Your orders to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
In less than 13 years, the man friends simply called Martin marched across America's conscience from Montgomery to Memphis. The nonviolent journey cut short in violence. But the bullet couldn't stop what the simple yet complex man from Atlanta had set in motion. In his short life, he whittled out a key to freedom's too often locked gate, and in the steps of the prophets of old made his way along the glory road. Almost 18 years later, if you want to listen, you can still hear his footsteps.
I think his legacy is one of conscience. What he did most, I think, was to quicken, to invigorate, to stimulate the conscience of this nation.
King, like Gandhi before him, has set a signpost. He said, look, here's the way I see it. And his perception was so valid that it has been studied and examined worldwide. And most people find it to be flawless.
Martin Luther King Jr. and the city of Detroit were great friends. Always welcome at our door, he found special comfort here for his cause, his vision, and his faith. He was particularly moved by one of us, a suburban housewife named Viola Liuzzo, who, struck by the injustices of Selma, too made a final journey to commitment, surrendering her life to night riders along an Alabama highway. And once again, Martin Luther King was bound for Detroit, but this time in sorrow.
We're all determined now to struggle harder to bring into full realization the things that she struggled for, but could not complete because of her untimely death. We will be sure that her death will not be in vain.
There were too many funerals in the 1960s, but for every tragedy, there was, too, a triumph of goodwill. For every bitter moment, a better one. Such is the magic of memory. And who among us who was there will ever forget a warm summer afternoon in June when Martin Luther King Jr. left his footprints on Woodward Avenue in perhaps the greatest civil rights demonstration ever held in the North?
I can remember going down Woodward and at some juncture just looking back and just seeing that sea of people that were involved in that particular demonstration.
There was the singing, there was the locking of arms as you walked down Woodward, and then ultimately he gave a talk, a speech, a major speech to us, which I think probably set the pace for the marches that occurred, many of them across the land after that.
I have a dream this afternoon that one day right here in Detroit, Negroes will be able to buy a house or rent a house anywhere that their money will carry them, and they will be able to get a job. Yes, I have a dream this afternoon.
It was a culmination of a dream. It was a demonstration of great black power and what great solidarity there was, a feeling for this business of freedom. But King, when he began to talk, I have a dream. It was so fantastic.
He changed your life, didn't he?
Yeah.
We'll make the dream become a reality. I know we will. Because our hearts tell us something.